Hi there, and welcome to chapter two of the analysis project, Africa, and the Cardinals falling. So, this is the second region that I'll be covering for the UN Geo scheme for the African continent. In chapter one, we looked at Central Africa, and so join me as we discover and uncover the interesting insights from this region. Now, the overview hasn't really changed from what was there before. So we'll just go through the nations in Eastern Africa by name. Then we'll look at the various metrics of comparison. So remember, as we go through all this, we're trying to get the top two nations for each of these economic metrics. And then after that, we're looking at how far the silent contender is from the cardinal here being the number one nation per that metric. Similarly to Central Africa, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find reliable data for the debt to GDP metric, and so we won't cover that in this analysis. But there'll be sufficient insights from all the others just to have interesting conversations around the state of Eastern Africa. So to begin, we'll cover the nations here, and so you can see out of all the UNG scheme regions in Africa, sorry, Eastern Africa has the largest number, so it has a total of 18 nations. And so just to go through them top down, you've got Eritrea, Djibouti, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Seychelles, Comoros, Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, and Mauritius. So those are all the nations, as you can see. And again, shout out to World Atlas for this incredible map that zones in each region by, in a sense, color coding the nations. So you saw something similar if you've already watched chapter one's video for Central Africa. Now, to start, we look at the region's population. And so for Eastern Africa, as of end of last year, the total population was at 450 million, approximately. And so just to highlight some of the top nations here, you've got Ethiopia with 106 million, then followed by Tanzania with 63 million people, then Kenya with 52 million, Uganda with 45 million, Mozambique with 34 million, and so on and so forth. And then the nations with the least number of people were Comoros, Seychelles, and Eritrea. And so you can see the top two here is Ethiopia and Tanzania. Ethiopia having a proportion of around 24%, and then followed by TZ with a proportion of 14%. Looking at the annual trend, you'll see that the population has been increasing year on year by approximately 10 million. So you can anticipate that as at the end of 2024 will probably be at 460 million people total. But just by zoning in on the individual nations, one nation that showed stagnant growth was Mauritius. So in Mauritius, there wasn't really a big change in the number of people comparing year on year, which was a bit interesting. That's definitely something to check out by the end of this year to see if the situation has changed. Then moving on to our first actual economic metric. Remember, population really addresses you could call it the human capital component, because of course the people are heavily involved in generating all these different elements of the economy. But now looking at the numbers themselves, we start with GDP. And so to begin, as of end of last year, Eastern Africa generated about half a trillion USD as the total GDP. And if we look at the top two here, you'll realize that the top two is Ethiopia with 155 billion dollars, and then Kenya with 113 billion dollars. So these are the top two nations with the highest GDP as of end of last year, which is our nearest relevant period of comparison. Then, if we consider the GDP trends for the whole region, you can see that it's been increasing steadily year on year. Of course, we had a bit of a dip in 2015. We also had a bit of a dip in 2020, as you can imagine. And if you even look at the real GDP growth percentage change curve, you can see that in 2020 there was that negative growth. So there's a very big fall between 2019 and 2020. But after that year in 2021, there was recovering. But you can see, unfortunately, again, there seems to be a slow decline. So 4.6, 4.5, 4.2. And so there's a chance that this might continue again into this year, even though the nominal GDP has been increasing since 2020, as you can see up top. Now, if you consider the decline that's happening, some of the nations driving this are Zimbabwe, Uganda, Seychelles, Rwanda, and Mauritius. So there's probably two more there, but these are just some of them that are driving this decline that we're seeing in terms of the real GDP growth, the change year on year. Then, if we now zone in still under GDP on the top two nations, I think this is a very interesting case of how things change between a cardinal and a contender. So, if you consider the period 2013 to 2021, Kenya was the cardinal because it had a higher GDP consistently than Ethiopia. However, you should observe that they were both trending upwards. And what happened then after 2021 is that Ethiopia, in a sense, usurped Kenya and crossed it at this point. So you can see as of 2022, Kenya had $113.7 billion, and then Ethiopia was at $120.37 billion. So since then, Ethiopia has grown uh, more than Kenya by quite a margin, actually. Because if you see this as of end of last year, 155 against 112, and you can even see with Kenya it was at 113 and then it dropped to 112. So actually, while Kenya lost by end of last year, Ethiopia gained and gained by a lot. And so if you factor in this trend, because Ethiopia has just been going up, there is a very low likelihood that Kenya will actually regain its position relative to Ethiopia. And so, in a sense, here now, Ethiopia becomes the new cardinal. And now, even though Kenya is, in essence, a silent contender now, there's a chance that it won't regain its position here. So, as a Kenyan, that's a bit humbling, of course, because there's the assumption that, oh, my nation is doing well, but when you look at the numbers, they definitely tell you the story of the situation on ground. Then, if you consider the real GDP growth percentage change and year on year, you can see that Ethiopia and Tanzania are the top two here. But if you see this, you'll realize that if you consider 2013 to 2020, Ethiopia was far above Tanzania just per magnitude. So you can see 6, 9, 10, 6, 10, 6, and then in 2018 they kind of got close to each other, but then that shifted again. But ever since 2020, things shifted. So you can see TZ started dropping after rising a bit, but then Ethiopia started dropping, sorry, and then TZ started rising. So you can see 4.9, 4.7, 5.2, and then 6.3, 6.4, 6.1. So if this continues, in essence, it means Ethiopia is on the decline and then TZ is on the incline. So in essence, we can assume that if this continues, then Tanzania is positioned to usurp Ethiopia in terms of the real GDP growth change rate. Then we've got inflation for the whole region. And for inflation, you can see inflation for the region has been high across the period, with exceptions to 2014 and perhaps 2018. Now, if you look at this, the peaks were in 2015, 2019, and 2022. And the rise, the hike here in 2022 is actually alarming if you compare the difference between the year before and where it fell back to. So this was, you could call this like an outlier in a sense. because the previous highest was in 2015. And so other hikes here are like 2021, 6.5, still below that, and 6.9 is approximately equal to that. So this hike here was quite surprising, I imagine. And so it seems that it's trending back downwards, but that remains to be seen. So this will be something to observe as well at the end of this year. Then, if you now zone in on the top two nations, you'll now look at Seychelles and Djibouti as your top two. Now, a few things. One, the y-axis has been inverted here because remember, if the inflation rate is lower, it's better for the country. Um, Normally, people perceive the line at the top of a line chart as the one that's better than the ones at the bottom. So just to in a sense uh, align with that psychological tendency that a viewer would have, that's what motivated the inversion of the y-axis here. Now, if you observe, these two trends, in a sense, look like mirror opposites of each other. So when one is up, the other is down, and that keeps happening on and on and on and on. But one thing to be able to distinguish these two that I looked at was the standard deviation of the inflation rate across our period here. And so Djibouti had a lower standard deviation than Seychelles, meaning that it was less erratic. And you can actually see that here. So take, for instance, 2015, Djibouti had a negative inflation rate, and then Seychelles went really high. So for Seychelles, when it's had very poor rates, it's been really poor compared to Djibouti. And then you've got situations where it was low. So let's take negative zero point 0.2. It hasn't been as low as the lows for Djibouti. So you can see Djibouti is negative 1.6 as the best rate across board. And then for Seychelles has had 7.9 as the worst, compared to something like 3.6 here for Djibouti. And then now you'll observe that for Seychelles, the rate has been going down. So as of end of last, it was at negative 1.1 from 2.5 the year before. And then Djibouti is 3.6 and 2.2. So in a sense, we can say Djibouti here is the cardinal, just on specifically that aspect of variability. But then, even though we're seeing that Seychelles, it's going downwards, just because of that variability, there's a chance that it might still spike up in the opposite direction, in which case it might even go above what Djibouti's rate will be. And so, there's a because of this aspect of variability, there's a chance that it might not usurp Djibouti in time to come. But if that happens, then that will be interesting to observe. Now we move to the perhaps most interesting metric here, which is the USD Forex rate. And so we'll just start off with the trend of the whole analysis period. So remember, for the USD, we're looking at January 1st, 2013 to end of Q1 2024, just for the sake of consistency here. Now, you'll observe that there's a bit of an interpolation here, just because for Zambia, the rates started from this period moving forward. So this interpolation is an approximation. Now, what you'll observe is first, for the period 2013 until 2020, Zambia had a stronger USD FX compared to Seychelles. And so that was consistent all through until things crossed over here. And even though they moved in the same direction for some time, Seychelles was able to gain against the dollar. So Seychelles, their currency is the Seychelles rupee, and then Zambia uses the kwacha. So the rupee gained around 2020, 2021, and then kwacha also started gaining, but it now started losing, and its variability actually increased at that point. So it was now starting to move in a direction opposite to what was happening for the rupee here. And so Based on this, Seychelles is now the current cardinal, and now Zambia is the silent contender. But just because of the direction in which the Kwacha is moving, it's unlikely that Zambia will usurp Seychelles anytime soon. Again, just as a final note, the y-axis has been inverted here because the lower the FX rate, the stronger the nation's currency against the US dollar. So in this case, with Seychelles on the top here, it's the one that has the stronger rate compared to Zambia's kwacha. Now, for the same trend, we'll now zoom in for 2024 alone. So remember, that's again January 1st, 2024, all the way till March 31st of this year. And just with the same inversion of the y-axis and also just focusing on the two nations, we can see the trend remains the same. Seychelles is far above Zambia, and at least now we can actually just see the difference in magnitude here. Seychelles seems to be largely to be more stable than uh, the Zambia kwacha, and you can see as of end of Q1 terminated at 13.5 compared to Zambia's 25. They're not very far off to the rates that are present at the time of recording this. So in a sense, it's unlikely that the kwacha will usurp the rupee here. Then we can also consider the trend of stability. So again, stability here is what's the changes, positive, negative across board. So just that indicator that shows the variability of how the rate is changing. Now here I use just standard deviation of this rate. So that's what I'm calling the Forex sigma. And again, the lower the sigma, the better. So the y-axis has also been inverted for this chart. So again, here with a classic case of kind of competition leading to crossing of situations. So at first, you will see that Seychelles had a lower standard deviation for this period 2013 to 2019. But then it started to lose its stability, and now Djibouti just took over and it kept improving. Of course, it's kind of started to decline here in terms of stability, but relative to Seychelles, it's doing better. So since 2019, Djibouti became the cardinal. And so, based on this, we could say that uh, Djibouti is a cardinal and then Seychelles is the silent contender. But then again, Seychelles, just like the inflation case, there's this aspect of variability. So Seychelles might be doing well nominally, but when you now dig deep into things like the volatility and so on and so forth, it starts to show that it's not exactly stable. So it's hard to place a bet on it that it's going to remain the same for a certain amount of time. And so, after looking at all these metrics, we now have the conclusion here. Just to summarize the comparison between the cardinal and the silent contender. And then also, we've got just a table on your right to show the different nations in this region and when their next election is. Because remember, politics, as we've observed, has quite an influence on the economics of the nation. And so, if, for instance, a nation's next election year is this year or in a year's time, there's a chance that that might have an impact on some of the insights that we've derived here, and also if some of the policies might change. If a nation's next election is some time to come, then there's a chance that some of the policies that have been implemented will stay some time. So we just continue. We might actually some of the insights that we derive from this might actually stick for the long haul. And so just top to bottom, for population, Ethiopia we realize was the largest compared to Tanzania. So there's a chance that it's a bit likely that TZ will get more people in a year's time or 2 years' time than Ethiopia. Then, if you consider nominal GDP, Ethiopia was larger than Kenya, and even just considering the trends, we realize that Kenya actually declining as compared to Ethiopia, who are on the uptrend. So again, we don't have an indication of a falling cardinal here. For real GDP growth rate, Ethiopia was the cardinal, and then TZ was the silent contender. But we observed that Tanzania is positioned to potentially usurp Ethiopia in a year or two. And if we look at this, we can see Tanzania has the next election next year, and Ethiopia has a current election this year. So we'll see whether the elections in Ethiopia have an impact on the economy, and then also with TZ if that will also influence them. So in the next 1 to 2 years, this can be something to observe. Um, then for inflation, we observe Djibouti and Seychelles as your cardinal and Seychelles as your cardinal and silent contender, sorry, respectively. But just based off on the variability from Seychelles end, there is not a likelihood that it will usurp Djibouti. So in this case, we don't have an indication that Djibouti is falling in terms of the inflation piece. And then finally, just across board on the USD metrics. So for the overall trend, Seychelles was greater than Zambia 2013 to 2024, and just specifically 2024. So just because of what we saw in terms of the difference in magnitude and also the variability that Zambia has been showing, where it's increasing in its instability, we do not have an indication that it will usurp Seychelles anytime soon. And then when you consider the stability itself, you compare now Djibouti as a cardinal and Seychelles. So Seychelles is more has more variability than Djibouti, and so it's unlikely to usurp it maybe in the next few months to a year. So thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Eastern Africa. It was interesting for me because that's the region that I come from, and so if again you paid attention, I kind of left a clue as to which region I will be going to next. So that is what we'll cover in the next video. So until then, take care, and I'll see you in chapter 3.